If I had known that the last words my husband, Daniel, whispered into my ear just before he took his final breath in that hospital bed were the key to a terrible secret that would shake the very foundations of my family, my children, and the life I had so carefully built for decades, perhaps at that moment I would have fainted, not from grief but from fear.
If my husband Daniel, my companion of 47 years, had not been the most honest, quiet, and dependable man I'd ever known, if he had ever once wronged me or our only son Michael, perhaps I would have been able to make sense of what he whispered to me on that final night when the doctors had already given up hope. Summoning the last of his strength, he leaned toward me and murmured, "My Rose, the old chest in the attic. Don't—" The words hung in the air like a cryptic farewell, suspended between sorrow and panic, their meaning lost in the haze of that unbearable moment. After the funeral, our home filled to the brim with people offering condolences. Michael, and especially his wife Emily, fluttered around me like anxious birds. "Please, Mom, don't tire yourself. We'll handle everything." Their constant attempts to comfort me, to ease my grief, seemed at first nothing more than the natural compassion of devoted children. After all, we had all lost the pillar of our family, that great oak whose presence had held us together through every storm. But once the guests had left, and the house fell into that deafening silence, Daniel's final, unfinished sentence began to echo endlessly in my mind. The old chest in the attic. It was the same wooden chest we had left to gather dust for decades, the one I believed held nothing but old letters and faded photographs. Why had he warned me with his dying breath not to do something concerning that chest? The question began to haunt my nights, turning my sleep into a recurring nightmare. The next morning, as soon as Michael and Emily left for work, I could no longer resist the strange pull in my chest. However vague my husband's warning had been, that final look in his eyes had carried not just farewell, but a desperate plea. Whatever he had hidden, I had to uncover it, if only to understand the last wish of the man I'd shared my life with. As I pulled down the old wooden ladder to the attic, the creak it made seemed to awaken not just the house, but long-buried memories sleeping within me. The sharp scent of dust hit my face as I climbed, and with each step, I felt as though I wasn't merely walking toward Daniel's secret, but descending into the darker corridors of my own past. In the far corner, half hidden behind an old cradle and an unused sewing machine, I saw it, the chest. My heart skipped a beat. This was no longer a harmless box of nostalgia, no longer the chest I thought contained baby shoes and mothballs. It had transformed into the silent keeper of a truth capable of casting a shadow over our 47-year marriage. When I finally broke open the rusted lock and lifted the heavy lid, the familiar smell of mothballs and the sight of our son's tiny first shoes brought a fleeting smile. But just beneath them, nestled among the warmth of old memories, lay something alien. A small, cold, metallic box with a keyhole. The moment I saw it, I understood the weight behind Daniel's dying "don't." That box was no ordinary keepsake. I had just taken it into my hands, shaking it slightly to see if it was locked, when the front door creaked open downstairs. I froze. The sound of keys jangling, then voices. Michael and Emily had come home far earlier than usual. They were never home before evening. It felt as though they had somehow sensed I'd gone into the attic. My fleeting curiosity turned into a rushing tide of dread. I hid the metal box quickly beneath an old blanket, took a deep breath, and climbed down the ladder without a sound. From the kitchen, I heard their hushed voices. "Not now, Michael," Emily whispered. "We need to wait for the right moment. She mustn't suspect anything." And in that instant, I realized Daniel's secret wasn't buried only inside that chest. It lived within the walls of this house and on the tongues of the very people I had trusted most.
The moment I froze in the kitchen doorway, still reeling from the venomous whisper I just overheard from Emily, I realized something chilling. Even the grief of burying my husband of 47 years could not compare to the icy emptiness left by a betrayal that came from my own flesh and blood. And so, with a calm I didn't truly feel, I fixed a delicate, practiced smile upon my face, a mask I'd never worn before, and stepped inside. When they saw me standing there, I caught the fleeting look of panic that flashed across both their faces before they replaced it with a clumsy cheerfulness, the kind people put on when they've just been caught hiding something. Their excuses, "We couldn't bear to leave you alone, Mom. We were worried about you," were no longer words of affection to my ears. They were the sly murmurs of hunters circling their prey. That afternoon, I sat in my own living room like a prisoner, while Emily stayed glued to my side, constantly asking if I needed anything. Michael, usually so reserved, wouldn't stop reminiscing about his father, slipping questions between his stories, testing my reactions. It didn't take a genius to see that their sudden attentiveness wasn't born of love. It was a clumsy attempt to find out whether I had gone up to the attic, whether I had found something. Emily, ever the actress, began to talk casually about her late father-in-law, how meticulous and organized he had been, and slowly steered the conversation toward finances, debts, and any documents Daniel might have left behind. Every sentence she spoke felt like bait, every glance like a fisherman's tug on the line, waiting to see if I would bite. But instead of confronting her, I let silence become my shield. Her performance, transparent as glass, gave me the chance to study every flicker of her expression, to learn exactly what she wanted. Then it came, the question I had been expecting. "Mom," she said softly, feigning innocent curiosity, "aside from the safe at the bank, do you think Dad might have kept anything important here at home? You know, just in case, papers, a will, something like that?" The image of the metal box buried beneath the blanket in the attic flashed in my mind like a burning coal. And I understood. My husband had not left me a secret. He had left me a battlefield. That bold, money-scented question asked in the middle of our mourning, while the scent of lilies still hung heavy in the air, settled in my throat like bitter bile. It confirmed what my heart already knew. The real danger in this house was no longer death, but the greed of the living. So I hid my revulsion behind the trembling voice of a grieving widow. I avoided
avoided Emily's bright, probing eyes and answered wearily, as though humoring her curiosity. "Your father was a simple man, honest to a fault. He never believed in hiding things. Everything he had was always properly accounted for, all in that one bank account. He wasn't the sort for secret safes or mysterious wills. Those things only happen in the movies, my dear." At that, I saw Michael's shoulders loosened in relief. But on Emily's face, the faintest shadow crossed her smile. For a heartbeat, the mask slipped. Her lips tightened ever so slightly, just enough for me to know she didn't believe me. In that instant, I understood without doubt. They weren't here to share my grief. They were here to hunt for what my husband had left behind. I knew I couldn't keep up this charade much longer. The box in the attic had to be opened, and I needed to be alone to do it. Feigning a sudden headache and exhaustion from grief, I thanked them for their kindness and told them I needed to take my medication and rest. I insisted they should go home, that all their care had been too much for me that day. The moment the door closed behind them, I straightened my back, shedding the stooped posture of the fragile widow. The air in the house changed. The fake sympathy dissolved, replaced by the cold resolve of a woman who finally understood her mission. Without wasting another second, I turned toward the stairs, toward the attic, toward the locked metal box, and toward the truth my husband had left for me to uncover. As the front door clicked shut and the sound of my son's car engine faded down the street, I shed the helpless, weary role I'd been wearing, and, fueled by a cold fury at the greed hiding behind my children's false tenderness, I climbed the attic ladder. Every creak of those steps felt now like a step not only toward my husband's secret, but toward the very source of the terrible betrayal that had wormed its way into our family. When I lifted the dusty blanket again and took that cold metal object into my hands, I realized it was no simple keepsake from Daniel's youth. It was modern, sturdy, and bore a small but intricate keyhole, something built to protect valuables or documents, not a shoebox of old photographs. The discovery made his dying "don't" sound even more ominous. No matter how much I shook the box, it answered only with a dull, muted thud. There was no hope it would open by force. The little lock felt like an impenetrable gate guarding a world even Daniel had kept from me. For a moment, I felt helpless in that attic. He had entrusted me with a secret, but had not left the key. Perhaps he had given me one final task, to search for it. After a few panicked minutes among the dust and cobwebs, I forced myself to think clearly. Daniel was never the type for elaborate puzzles or coded games. He hid his most precious things simply, often in plain sight, yet in a place that felt personal and private. And suddenly, a single obvious place flashed into my mind. The top drawer of the walnut dresser in our bedroom, the drawer he'd guarded as his own for 47 years. I slid the metal box back beneath the blanket as carefully as one might tuck away a poisonous snake, descended from the attic in silence, and walked straight to our bedroom, the room that had borne witness to every quiet moment of our marriage. That once familiar space now felt foreign. The scent on the pillow and the memories imbued in the walls made it feel less like a home and more like the last stronghold of the secrets he'd kept from me. I was about to rummage through his most private things like a thief in my own life. I stood for a moment before the dresser and hesitated to touch the dull brass knob. That drawer had been Daniel's tiny world. His rosary, his battered wristwatch, a dried flower used as a bookmark, things I had been too respectful to question. To open it without his permission felt like an unforgivable trespass against his soul. At last, I summoned my courage and pulled the drawer open. The air that met me carried his familiar scent, his lavender cologne mixed with tobacco, and for a second I swayed. Then my eyes began to scan the clutter with desperate speed. Beneath old handkerchiefs, cufflinks, and our grandchild's meaningless scribbles, I sensed the presence of that small key that could change our family's future, and yet I was terrified to find it. Digging down to the very bottom, my fingers brushed something that wasn't cold metal, but the rough edge of a folded old envelope tucked carefully under the velvet lining. It occurred to me then that what I sought may not be a mere key at all, that Daniel had layered this secret, wrapping it in more than one small hiding place, and perhaps weaving a story deeper than I could imagine. And there it was, tucked beneath the velvet as if placed there as a last resort, a small bright key whose shape matched the modern peculiar lock on the metal box. It shone as proof of its purpose. When I lifted it between my fingers, I tasted the brief exhilaration of victory, immediately followed by a dreadful weight. I knew then that there was no turning back. If I raised the lid of that attic box, I would not only uncover a secret, I might also reveal a face of the man I loved that I had never known. The tiny metal piece resting in my palm felt, in that familiar, sorrowful silence of our bedroom, as if its weight dragged not only my hand, but the very pillars of our 47 years of marriage downward. The fleeting triumph of having found the key was quickly replaced by a cold fear. Whatever lay inside that box might crush the happy memories I had of my husband into dust. Each step down the dark corridor toward the attic now felt like walking through my own home as a stranger, a ghost roaming among my memories. The cheerful family photos on the walls no longer smiled with warmth. They seemed to mock me with fragments of a lie. Only Daniel's last painful look echoed in my mind. Why had he hidden this secret until his final breath? And that question rang like a bitter bell. When I reached the landing with the creaking ladder for the third time, I knew this visit was no childish curiosity or desperate search. It was the inevitable, irreversible confrontation. I grabbed the ladder rope as if it were a noose tied to my fate and hauled myself up. The wood groaned ominously like the sound of a coffin lid about to open. This time I climbed the dusty steps not with fear, but with an icy resolve. I crossed the dim attic at once and went straight to the corner where the blanket lay. I lifted the cold metal box from beneath it and, as if placing a sacrifice on an altar, set it directly into the single shaft of light that pierced the dirty window. At last, my two cursed objects, the box and the key, sat together, the tangible pieces of my fate. My fingers trembled as I brought the little bright key toward the lock. In that instant, the memory of Emily's money-hungry eyes and Michael's helpless, timid silence flashed before me, and I realized whatever was in that box was no longer just my late husband's secret. It could become my single, most powerful weapon in the fight to survive against those two-faced vultures. I inhaled and slowly slid the key into the lock. When I turned that tiny key, as if stirring a frozen heart, the cold, clean click rang out like a bullet in the dusty attic. The sound seemed to shatter not merely the metal lock, but the foundation upon which I had built 47 years of trust, loyalty, and memory. For the few seconds I raised the lid with a hesitation that felt like expecting a snake to spring forth. My mind raced through 1,000 dreadful scenarios: shameful love letters, unknown debts, a secret will leaving everything to someone else. Whatever lurked beneath could destroy the portrait of the quiet, honest man I had known. But when I removed the lid completely, the sight that met me struck like a shard of glass. Rather than legal papers or stacks of cash, on top of everything there lay an old black and white photograph. In it, an unfamiliar, young, beautiful woman smiled while cradling a baby in her arms. The image screamed that Daniel's secret was not a matter of money, but a life I had never known he led, a life kept from me. As I held the photograph between my fingers, the woman's joyful smile felt like a mockery from years past, a celebration of a private world built on top of my naive happiness. The chill I felt in the attic was not only from dust, it came from the bottomless pit of betrayal at the thought that the man I had shared a pillow with for 47 years might have harbored another woman, and perhaps a child I had never known. I wiped the tears from my eyes with the back of my hand and set that cruel photo aside. When I looked into the bottom of the box, I found the real bombshell. Beneath the picture were formal-looking documents and an old bank passbook, and the name printed on them was not Daniel's. It was the name of a man I had never heard of. In that instant, I understood that my husband had left me not only a hidden family, but a hidden identity and an entirely different life.
When my eyes locked onto the name Henry Mason stamped on the cover of the bank passbook I'd pulled from my husband's secret chest, time seemed to stop for a moment. That name belonged to no one in our family and to no relative I knew. It was the cold, official proof of a fabricated identity my husband Daniel had kept from me for 47 years, a shadow self he had built in a parallel life. With a fear like touching poisoned paper, I began to turn the old pages of the passbook. I felt the slow, sickening realization that the account opened under Henry Mason had received regular, substantial deposits far beyond the little sums Daniel might have squirreled away for household pocket money. When I reached the final page and saw the vast balance, it became horribly clear why my daughter-in-law Emily had been so eager to search the house for hidden things and what lay behind the performance of her false tears, a raw hunger for money. My blood rushed to my head.
With trembling hands, I drew out one of the other sealed envelopes from the bottom of the cold metal box, the heaviest, most official one. Breaking its seal felt like tearing not just paper, but the sacred vows of marriage woven from Daniel's honor and my own trusting heart. Yet no matter how bitter the truth might be, I had to know it. The document slipped into my palm. It was a title deed for an apartment in one of London's most exclusive neighborhoods, a property registered in the name of the woman I'd just seen in that black and white photograph. In that instant, I understood with a bone-deep chill that Daniel hadn't created the false identity Henry Mason merely to hide a bank account. He had used that identity to build a separate, luxurious life for a secret family, funded with money taken from me and from our own son. The betrayal pierced me to the marrow. Sitting amid the wreckage of 47 years in that dusty attic, the meaning of Daniel's last whisper, "Don't," finally came into focus. He hadn't been trying to keep me from a trivial secret. He was trying with his final breath to warn me, protect this secret from being plundered by Emily, who would stop at nothing to seize the house and the money while I grieved. The time for mourning was over. The time for war had begun. Holding those incriminating documents, the title deed, the fat bank passbook, I knew I ought to weep, to dissolve into ruin, but no tears came. What filled me instead was a pure, stinging rage, clean and sharp, the only thing that could keep me alive, and that I realized would be my only weapon against Emily's greedy plot. Carefully, as though stowing away a venomous snake, I returned the papers to the cold metal box, closed the lid, locked it, and slipped the key back into its hidden place beneath the dusty blanket. I left no trace. This secret was no longer my heaviest burden. It was my greatest leverage. When I climbed down from that ominous attic into the memory-filled rooms of my home, the house no longer felt like a refuge, but like a battlefield teeming with two-faced hunters. Emily's whispered line, "We must wait for the right moment," struck me with sickening clarity. They already knew of Daniel's secret, or at least suspected it, and they had been biding their time, waiting to exploit my grief. The time for mourning was over. The time for war had begun.
The next morning, before the first weak sunlight could lift the weight of my mourning in the sitting room, I woke to the familiar click of the front door key. Not a sound of family warmth, but the unmistakable signal that my wardens had arrived to check on me. After what I'd found in the attic, I knew I was no longer an innocent woman grieving in her home. I was a prisoner trying to survive inside a ring of betrayal spun by my own family. My daughter-in-law, Emily, sidled up to me with a bowl of soup I didn't know the contents of, and offered the staged tenderness. "Mom, you haven't eaten since the terrible news. I made soup myself." Behind her, Michael stood like a guilty official assigned to measure my reactions, his silence heavy with guilt. Their visit's true purpose was obvious. They wanted to know whether I had gone up to the attic, whether I'd found the locked box. I played the part they expected.
a bereft, confused woman, and murmured that my head ached and that I had no idea how to handle Daniel's official paperwork, the bank or pension matters. Then, as if it had casually occurred to me, I mentioned the name of Daniel's old friend and trusted lawyer, Keenan. The instant I spoke it, a shadow of panic flickered across Emily's face, and her practiced smile froze for a beat. She hurriedly put Michael forward, saying, "Oh, Mom, he's very old now. No need to bother him for these simple things. Michael can sort everything out. Right, Michael?" Their reaction was clearer than any confession. They were terrified of Keenan. I didn't fall into their trap. Instead, maintaining my helpless act, I murmured, "I'm not sure. Daniel always used to say, 'If anything happens to me, find Keenan,'" and closed the subject. I convinced them I was too exhausted to deal with it and sent them home. The moment they left, I dropped the mask. I pulled Daniel's old address book from his desk, found Keenan's number, and dialed. My voice no longer trembled. "Keenan, this is Gul. I'm Daniel's wife. I need to speak to you urgently about my husband's other life," I said. There was a long silence on the other end, then Keenan's measured, grave voice. "Gul, what do you mean by Daniel's other life? Please come to my office immediately and tell no one, especially not Michael." When he said that, I felt both the isolation of my task and the flicker of relief that I might have found a reliable ally who was as shocked as I was. Paranoid that Michael and Emily might appear at any moment to check on me, I hid the betrayal documents, the bank passbook in the name Henry Mason, the title deed for the woman in the photograph, and the heartbreaking picture itself, deep in the bottom of my old market bag beneath a few rotten apples, and began planning my escape from my own home like a thief. Around the corner, I hailed a taxi and watched familiar streets slide by, realizing how much the neighborhood had been a stage for a vast lie. The weight of the papers in my bag felt like the coming storm that would break over my whole family. I was heading not just to a solicitor's office, but to the very center of the dark world my husband had hidden from me. Keenan's office was lined with law books and dust, a place that inspired trust. I sat opposite his heavy mahogany desk, and without a word, I set the documents, the deed, the passbook, the photograph, between us. Time seemed to stop. I watched Keenan's face go ashen the instant he read the unfamiliar name, Henry Mason. "Gul," he said, glasses low on his nose, horror in his voice. "This can't be. Daniel was my friend for 40 years. I managed his estate and legal affairs. I swear to you, I have never seen this signature, this name, or this woman. Daniel has lied to both of us." Hearing him say that made me understand in cold disbelief that the web of deceit Daniel had woven was far deeper, far more professional, and far more dangerous than I had imagined, and that both of us had been deceived.
When I heard Keenan, the man my husband had trusted most, whisper, I was deceived too, in that office lined with dusty law books, what I felt wasn't grief. It was a strange, twisted sense of relief. For the first time in this bottomless pit of betrayal, I wasn't alone. Daniel's web of lies had been so masterfully woven that it had ensnared not only a housebound wife like me,
but also a professional whose entire career had been built on uncovering deceit. After a few heavy minutes of silence, the grief drained from Keenan's face and was replaced by the sharp gaze of a hawk assessing its prey. He picked up the documents, analyzing the notary stamps on the deed, the suspicious branch name printed in the bank book, the woman's fashion in the old photograph, all with the precision of a detective. In that moment, we ceased to be a mourning widow and a stunned friend. We became a client and her solicitor. He said, "Mrs. Gould, this bank account, it's under the name Henry Mason, yes? But the automatic deposits come directly from Daniel's legitimate pension account, the one you both shared." The words hit me like a knife. My husband hadn't just financed his secret life with money stolen from me. He had used our joint savings, the fruits of our shared years of work, turning his betrayal from emotional to outright theft. Then came Keenan's voice, even colder. "Mrs. Gould, the real question is, when you said your daughter-in-law knows about this money, you weren't joking, were you? Because if they know these documents exist, and if they suspect you found them, this stops being an inheritance matter. They could become desperate, dangerous, enough to make you confess everything while you're alone in that house." His warning crystallized the vague dread I'd felt all along. The role I'd been playing, the confused, harmless old widow, was no longer a strategy. It was a lifeline. When I left that office clutching my market bag full of betrayal, Keenan's final words echoed in my mind. "Go home and keep playing the grieving mother. Say nothing. I'll start investigating Henry Mason, the woman on the deed, and every penny in that account, quietly." I returned home not as a victim, but as a spy, one with a powerful ally. As the taxi carried me back toward the house that no longer felt like a home, the weight of the documents hidden beneath a few decaying apples in my bag pressed on me like a curse. I had to put the metal box back in its place, untouched, unseen. The secret was now my weapon, and I had to protect it. When I slipped silently into the house like a thief, the heavy stillness felt like a blessing. If Emily and Michael had returned before me, there would have been no way to explain what I carried. The game would have ended before it began. I climbed the creaking attic steps one last time, opened the box, and returned each item, the deed, the passbook, the shameful photograph, to its resting place beneath the blanket. My hands shook, not from the cold metal, but from the terror of being caught. When I carefully closed the attic hatch and started down the stairs, the sound of the front door unlocking froze me where I stood. "Mother, are you home? Where have you been?" Emily's suspicious voice cut through the silence. In that instant, I realized just how right Keenan's warning had been, and how closely this greedy woman was watching my every move, circling above me like a hawk. Has Emily's poisonous hiss. "So, were you in the attic then?" echoed through the corridor. The weight of the modern key in my pocket suddenly felt like a 1,000-pound iron bar. Being caught now would mean more than the discovery of the box. It would mean exposure of my husband's betrayal and of my knowledge of it, and that would be the end of me. I let the frozen fear inside me hide behind the sobs of a grief-stricken, shattered widow. I deliberately dropped the empty market bag to the floor and cried out in a trembling voice, "What would I be doing in the attic, child? After losing your father, now you treat me like a thief?" My strongest, most convincing defense appealed to her conscience. I told the pathetic little story about how I had really gone to the market, but in the crowd had thought I heard your father's voice and had been so distraught that I forgot what I was buying and came home in tears. I added, almost at random, that the latter simply reminded me of some old memory with Daniel. And for a heartbeat, Emily's hawk eyes softened. The ruse had worked, for now. She shepherded me back to the familiar prison of the living room couch with faux concern. "We just want to check you're all right, make sure you're with it." But I knew that this brief retreat was tactical, not trusting. Her gaze stayed fixed on me, searching for any opening. When Emily slipped into the kitchen to fetch a glass of water, an opportunity lasting only seconds, the key in my pocket suddenly felt like a ticking bomb. I realized that her surveillance in this house would make it nearly impossible to return that most crucial piece of evidence to its rightful place, Daniel's bedroom drawer. If she watched me too closely, I would be trapped. Her trembling hand pressed the glass into mine like poison as she returned. The metal coldness of the key seared my palm. I knew I no longer lived alone in the house. I lived under the eyes of a guardian who would watch every breath and every tear to find that secret fortune. Just as I suspected, Emily slithered close and suggested, sweet as venom, "Perhaps we should look through your husband's private things together, Mum. Go through his drawers. It might make things easier." Her offer revealed the truth. She wasn't after the attic at all. She wanted direct access to the drawer where the key in my pocket belonged. If she let her go to that drawer now, the absence of the key would ruin everything. So I clung to the widow act one last time, sobbing that his drawers were his private sanctuary, that to touch them would be the greatest disrespect to his memory, and that I simply wasn't ready, perhaps never would be. But Emily pressed, steel beneath silk. "We can't delay these things, Mum. Papers get lost, things go missing, and then we'll be in trouble." Her tone made clear time was running out. I had to rid myself of the key, unseen, before she forced the issue. If I didn't, she would win. Then, in a desperate, sudden maneuver, I feigned a sharp pain, a little gasp, and a hand to my chest, and allowed the rosary I always carried to fall from my lap. As Emily bent instinctively to pick up the beads, that fleeting, priceless second opened like a knife. My hand darted into my pocket, snatched out the cold metal key, and with lightning speed, I shoved it into the dark hollow beneath the cushion of my battered, sagging armchair, a hiding place no one would think to look.
Venomous whisper. "Were you in the attic then? Hung in the corridor? The wake of that cursed modern key in my pocket suddenly felt like a block of iron weighing tons. Being caught now would mean not only the discovery of the box, but exposure of Daniel's betrayal and of my knowledge of it, and that would be the end of me.
I let that icy fear hide behind the sobs of a widow whose heart had been torn by grief. I deliberately let the empty market bag fall to the floor and in a trembling voice cried out, "What would I be doing in the attic, child? After losing your father, are you going to treat me like a thief?" My most powerful defense appealed to her conscience. I told the pitiful little tale about how I'd really gone to the market, but lost in the crowd, thought I heard my husband's voice and had been so distraught that I forgot what I was buying and came home in tears. I added, almost by accident, that the latter had simply reminded me of some old memory with Daniel, and for a moment Emily's hawk-like stares softened, for now my ruse had worked. She tugged me back to the familiar prison of the sofa with fake concern. "We just worry about you. We want to make sure you're all right." But I knew that retreat was tactical. Her eyes never left me. She searched for an opening. When Emily slipped into the kitchen to fetch a glass of water, those seconds felt like a lifetime. The key in my pocket felt like a time bomb. I realized her surveillance in the house would make returning that crucial piece of evidence to Daniel's drawer almost impossible. If she watched me too closely, I would be trapped. She returned with the glass as if offering poison. The metal coldness of the key burned my palm. I knew I no longer lived alone in this house. I lived with a guardian who watched every breath and every tear, hungry for the hidden fortune. Just as I'd feared, Emily slid close and sweet as a snake suggested, "Maybe we should look through your husband's private things together, Mum. Go through his drawers. It might make things easier." Her offer revealed the truth. She didn't care about the attic. She wanted the drawer, the very place the key in my pocket belonged. If I let her go to that drawer now, the absence of the key would bring my plan crashing down. So I clung to the widow act one last time, sobbing that his drawers were his private sanctuary, that touching them would be the greatest disrespect to his memory, and that I simply wasn't ready, perhaps never would be. But Emily pushed. "We can't delay these things, Mum. Papers get lost, things disappear, and then we'll be in trouble." Her steely undertone made it clear time was running out. I had to rid myself of the key unseen before she forced the issue. Otherwise, she would win. Then, in a desperate ploy, I feigned a sharp pain, a sudden and a hand to my chest, and let the rosary I always carried slip from my lap. As Emily bent instinctively to pick up the beads, that brief, priceless second opened like a blade. My hand darted into my pocket, snatched the cold metal key, and with lightning speed, I shoved it into the dark hollow beneath the cushion of my battered, sagging armchair, a hiding place no one would think to check.
When my daughter-in-law Emily's suffocating presence finally left the house, I shrugged off the cloak of helplessness I had been wearing and, clutching the small, bright key like a badge of victory, made my way to the bedroom, to the walnut dresser that guarded my husband's most private things. There was no grief or fear in my steps now, only the cold determination of a soldier who must eliminate the last and most dangerous piece of evidence before the frost-cold truth I would learn tomorrow morning shattered
everything I had held dear. A few days earlier, I had stood before that dresser and been afraid even to open it. This time I seized the tarnished brass knob without a flicker of hesitation. The familiar scent of lavender and tobacco that rose from the drawer no longer called up 47 years of memory. It only reminded me of a cleverly staged lie. I looked at those old objects as if they were instruments of a crime rather than sentimental keepsakes. With painstaking care, as if nothing had ever been touched, and as if no one could ever suspect, I slid the key back beneath the old velvet lining into its hidden place. My hands carried out this delicate task with a surgeon's precision, aware of the terrible possibility that Emily might one day rummage through that drawer and notice the slightest disturbance. The dull thud the drawer made as it closed sounded, to me, like the final nail driven into the coffin of Daniel's honest man identity. Standing there in our bedroom among a flood of false memories, I no longer looked backward. I looked ahead to the merciless future that would begin when, at 9 the next morning, I learned from Mr. Charles Kent exactly who the woman named on the deed was. When I heard the distant rumble of my son Michael's car in the street that evening, I returned to the living room, to my grim stronghold, and took up my rosary. Staring blankly into space, I slipped back into the role of the exhausted, grieving wife. I would hide the ice-cold fury inside me and wait for the final devastating secret that would freeze everyone's blood. That night, I did not sleep. After Michael's clumsy, blind goodnight kiss, I lay in our cold bed and turned the attic box and Daniel's betrayal over in my mind until the first light of dawn. Then, with a jar of pickles as my cover and the neighborly lie already rehearsed, I stepped out, not to visit a neighbor, but to take the last bitter step in the funeral of my own family. I arrived at Mr. Kent's office at 9 on the dot. The shock and sorrow I had seen on his face the day before were gone. They had been replaced by a disgust so physical it looked like nausea. Before I could say good morning, he pointed to the deed and the photograph on his desk and said, "Mrs. Gould, I told you this would freeze your blood. I wish it were only that." He told me in a voice as cold as ice that his overnight research into the identity Henry Mason, the name on the deed, and the bank account had uncovered something more than a single betrayal. It revealed an organized, long-running conspiracy that had been operating inside my home. He pushed across a freshly stamped official record, the identity paperwork for the woman in that photograph. When I read the name on that paper, time stopped. The woman who owned the title, the one Daniel had been funding under the false identity of Henry Mason, was not some distant mistress I'd never met. She was the person who had been in my house for 15 years, the woman who called me Mom, and who, smiling in that photograph as she cradled a baby, was none other than my daughter-in-law, Emily herself. The baby in her arms was Emily's child from long before she married Michael, a child she had kept secret from him and that Daniel had fathered in her youth. Daniel's last words had been a confession, not a warning. My mourning ended in an instant. The most ruthless revenge of my life began right then.